Welcome, everyone, to the ISS for the launch of the latest Adelphi book, Drugs, Insecurity and Failed States, The Problems of Prohibition. The failures and the unintended but disastrous consequences of the international prohibition regime were aired very publicly this weekend at the Summit of the Americas in Colombia. Ahead of the meeting, the President of Guatemala said it was a fallacy to think the global market for drugs could be eradicated, so it was necessary to move to regulation. This was a conclusion already arrived at by the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which included 3 Latin American presidents, formerly, Kofi Annan and former US Secretary of State Paul Volcker. The Commission called for experimenting with models of legal regulation. With the US and Canada represented at the summit last weekend, it's not surprising that they...
Would you mind switching your microphone on? Because we can't hear you at all.
It looks like it is on.
Yeah.
Project. Is that better, Robert? Okay. With the US and Canada represented at the summit, it's perhaps not surprising that the recommendations did not go that far. However, Barack Obama and Stephen Harper both accepted that the current policy has been a dismal failure and that new approaches had to be considered. The fact that sitting presidents and prime ministers are now talking in such terms rather than waiting until they're not constrained by office is significant. So, to discuss the security problems arising from the global drug trade, we have today the 2 authors of the most recent Adelphi. Nigel Inkster is the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk here at ISS. Virginia Comolli is a research analyst here at the ISS. We'll have the talking part of it for the Q&A in 3 sections. Firstly, Nigel will speak to introduce the contours of the problem and some of the lines of analysis. We'll then turn to Virginia, who will give some of the detail on the case studies, and then back to Nigel to develop some of the conclusions arising. Nigel.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and many thanks for coming. I don't think either Virginia or I imagined when we joined IISS about the same time that we'd end up writing a book about drugs. And the fact that we did so is something that I can really attribute to a happy accident. But once we did decide to address the issue just over 18 months ago, it became pretty clear to us very quickly that this was a topic that sat extremely well with the IISS mission statement, which is to promote a better public understanding of the problems of conflict, however caused, which have or potentially have a significant military content. Because over the past 50-plus years, since the coming into force of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which is the foundation stone of the current global prohibition regime, there has been a close correlation between drugs and armed conflict in numerous parts of the developing world. And it is this which is at the center of the study we have produced. Much of the discourse on drugs in the Western media over the years has been about the harms that the drug trade causes within consumer countries, in particular their impact on young people and the criminality associated with long-term problem drug users seeking to raise money to support their habit. But relatively little attention has been accorded to the aspect of the drugs trade which has created the greatest amount of harm, either in the form of comprehensive corruption of vulnerable states by criminal gangs, whose resources often exceed those of the states that they're seeking to subvert, or in the form of high levels of violence, which impact detrimentally on the national and human security of producer and transit states, and on more than one occasion have called into question the very survival of these states. And to understand how this has come to pass, one needs to go back to the origins of the drugs problem in the form that we have come to know it today. Mankind has always consumed a wide range of psychoactive substances, some obviously more harmful than others. But it was really during the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries that drugs began to command the attention of the policy community. And the 2 drivers for this were the development by Western colonial powers of opium monopolies, the revenues from which were used to defray the administrative costs of running their colonies, and the growing misuse of opiate and coca-based medicines in the developed world. And we saw a combination of moral indignation over the international opium trade and concern about the public health consequence of drugs misuse, which led to a search for solutions which focused exclusively on supply reduction. Eventually, these efforts coalesced into the prohibition-based narcotics regime we have today, which has combined supply reduction with prohibition. And, of course, the problems with prohibition have been widely identified, and we claim no particular credit for associating ourselves with them, because it is the UN body responsible for overseeing the current regime, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which in its 2008 annual report highlighted 5 perverse consequences of the regime, and these were the creation of criminal black markets, policy displacement, in other words, the propensity for a law enforcement-based approach to counter narcotics to crowd out the public health dimensions of the drugs problem, geographical displacement, otherwise known as the balloon effect, whereby pressure or production on trafficking in one region simply displaces the problem elsewhere. Substance displacement, in other words, when consumers deprived by law enforcement action of one drug simply move to another that is more readily available. And finally, the social exclusion and marginalization of drugs users. And it is the developing world where these perverse consequences have had the most deleterious impact. And this is the aspect of the problem which is at the center of our study. There are plenty of drugs we could write about, but we focused on 2, namely heroin and cocaine, for a number of reasons. Of all the illicit drugs currently available, these 2 are the most potent and the consequences relating to their misuse most severe. They are the 2 drugs most closely associated with high levels of conflict and instability, not least because they can only be cultivated to any scale in ungoverned spaces where criminality and insurgency most easily thrive. They are the drugs that have the greatest added value in terms of the markups that take place between farm gate and retail at the street, and they are amongst the most easily transportable and smuggleable of all the drugs that are around. Now, of course, drugs aren't the only commodity associated with violence and instability in the developing world, nor are they the only commodity trafficked by criminal organizations. But their immense profitability and low obstructability mean that drugs remain an important and reliable element in the revenues of both criminal gangs and insurgent groups. And I'd like to ask Virginia to talk through some of the conclusions that we've reached from our case studies.
I would like now to take you through some of the specific case studies that we have looked at through the course of our research. The cases of Colombia and Afghanistan are very different, but they also have some important commonalities. Both have suffered for the past 30 years from very high levels of violence in which narcotics have played a major role. During the 1980s, Colombia faced a challenge from powerful vertically integrated cartels, which both subverted the institutions of the Colombian state and posed a direct armed challenge to the state's authority. This was followed by a major insurgency by the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, also known as the FARC, whose involvement in the narcotics trade enabled them to move from being of strategic irrelevance to a position where they pose an existential threat to the survival of the state. Colombia has succeeded in reducing these threats to manageable proportions, but at an enormous cost. A defense budget that still consumes 4.5% of GDP, an internally displaced population of 4 million, a massive opportunity cost in terms of economic development foregone. It is estimated, in fact, that the past 30 years of conflict have cost the Colombian economy between 2 and 3% of GDP every year. And substantial sums set aside to compensate the victims of violence. And on top of this, while levels of cocaine production have declined, the cocaine trade and its associated criminality are far from having been eradicated. Afghanistan has become a monopoly supplier of heroin to the planet, accounting for 85% of global output. The Afghan drugs trade benefits both powerful warlords who have become part of the Kabul administration and the Taliban insurgents, who are thought to derive $125 million per year from the drugs trade. For many Afghan farmers, opium cultivation represents the only way of earning a living and supporting their families. And opium has become a substitute for the social welfare system that the Afghan government is unable to provide to its citizens. NATO ISAF have engaged in sporadic efforts at opium eradication and have also targeted some of the trafficking kingpins. But the imperatives of a counterinsurgency campaign, which critically depends on securing popular consent, mean that counter-narcotics had to take a second place. And efforts to target the main traffickers have often fallen foul of a pervasive culture of impunity. Although it is impossible to say with any certainty what will happen in Afghanistan after the NATO ISAF drawdown in 2014, it is safe to assume that some level of conflict will continue, and in the worst case, it will also be a renewal of civil war. In such circumstances, it is hard to see how opium production can be reduced in the short term. And it might well increase, as all parties potentially involved in future conflict stockpile resources to that end. States affected by drugs trade face a choice between allowing their institutions to be comprehensively subverted or to stage a fight back with all that entails in terms of violence and instability. A good example of this is Mexico, which for many years operated a symbiotic relationship with trafficking groups, controlling a business now worth $14 billion a year. The decision of Mexican President Calderon to end this symbiotic relationship has had dramatic consequences, with two wars now taking place, one between the government and the traffickers, and the other one between the trafficking groups. This has resulted in 47,000 drugs-related deaths over the past 4 years, and a pervasive culture of intimidation by narcotics traffickers. This violence has now spilled over into Central America, which has taken over from the Caribbean as the principal smuggling route for drugs destined for the USA. Just think that between 2007 and 2010, the amount of cocaine trafficked to the USA via Central America went from 1% to 95%. And levels of drug-related violence rose correspondingly. In El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, the so-called Northern Triangle, drug-related homicides are now 4 times higher than in Mexico, and even more shockingly, they are higher than during the Civil War periods in the 1980s. Meanwhile, the culture of state capture and violence brought to the Caribbean, when that was the main trafficking route for cocaine to the US, has not significantly eroded, as evidenced by the violence in Jamaica, resulting from the efforts to extradite Jamaican drug baron Christopher Dudu's coke to the US, or the high levels of drugs-related violence that Trinidad and Tobago are currently experiencing. Meanwhile, the balloon effect has seen some very fragile states in West Africa become deeply implicated in the international drugs trade, as pressure on the direct transatlantic route to Europe has led traffickers to relocate their operations. So far, this has not led to very high levels of violence, although the recent coup in Guinea-Bissau is clearly linked to the narcotics trade. But it has led to wholesale corruption and the emergence of what some scholars have called junkie economies, i.e., economies in which the revenues from the drugs trade supplant legitimate economic activities. Countries such as Ghana, which seemed well on the way of meeting their Millennium Development Goals, may not do so due to the damaging effects of the drugs trade. And in parts of West Africa, drug gangs have earned a degree of popular consent by providing social welfare facilities way beyond those that the state is capable of providing. And this was already an approach that was pioneered by Pablo Escobar in Medellin in the 1980s in Colombia. But now, just back to Nigel.
Okay, thanks very much, Virginia. The first thing I would say is that we do need to be careful to distinguish between correlation and causation in all of this, and we've tried to do so in the book. Many of the countries mentioned above had experienced high levels of violence well before drugs entered the picture. But in all cases, drugs have played a role in reigniting and, more critically, sustaining conflicts, the seed of which had already been planted earlier for some other reason. And when one looks at the totality of the problem in terms of national and human security and the opportunity costs in terms of economic development and good governance, the problems of drugs-related violence worldwide seem to amount to a whole that is rather more than the sum of its parts. And this, to our mind, invites the question as to whether what we're doing about drugs really is the best available option and whether there are alternatives which should be explored. And it's important to state at the outset that this will not be easy to achieve. As we saw at the Summit of the Americas, there are powerful vested interests supporting the status quo, including a number of key states, not just the United States, but also countries such as China and Russia, who are likely to prove resistant to change. But as evidenced by what happened at the Summit of the Americas, there are signs that the tectonic plates are starting to shift. Latin American leaders feel their countries are paying a disproportionate price for a problem whose origins lie in demand in the developed world, and have begun to demand a rethink based on a dispassionate, evidence-based approach to possible alternative policies, including decriminalization and legalization. IISS is not an organization which engages in advocacy, and it's not our intention in this book to come out in support of any particular drugs policy. All we can do is examine the evidence as we see it and draw our own policy conclusions. And some of these conclusions, not the totality of them, but the main ones, are as follows. An approach which treats drugs as a problem to be solved, epitomized by the United Nations General Assembly Special Sessions of 1998 and 2008, which had the strapline, "A Drugs-Free World," needs to be substituted for one which sees drugs as an issue to be managed. And management of the issue should involve a minimum of collateral damage. Current policies to restrict non-medical use of drugs appear not to be working. Global demand has for many years remained broadly constant and, in parts of the developing world and newly emerging economies, rising. Meanwhile, efforts to make drugs such as heroin and cocaine available for legitimate medical use have made little progress other than in a handful of developed countries. People in the developing world suffering from serious conditions, late-stage cancer and other treatments requiring palliative care tend to get a pretty raw deal. It seems to us that there really is a need for an open, informed debate about alternatives to the current regime based on empirical evidence. Supporters of the status quo have for too long sought to squash such debate without really offering convincing argumentation for their stance. The issue of drugs needs to be brought out of the specialist silo it currently occupies, and it should be integrated into the mainstream of debate on international security and economic development to a much greater degree than is currently the case. And finally, consumer states should acknowledge a greater responsibility to provide practical assistance, including security assistance, to those developing countries affected by narcotics-related violence and instability. We plan to leave plenty of time for question and discussion, and I think we've just about timed it right. But before closing, I'd just like to pay tribute to some of the people who've helped us to produce this book, which we hope, if nothing else, will serve as a useful primer on the subject for policy community. We received generous financial support from the Open Society Foundation, which, though it openly advocates legalization of drugs, has behaved impeccably in not seeking to influence the direction of our research or our conclusions. This OSF funding enabled us to organize 2 workshops which brought together experts from many different countries and constituencies: governments, international organizations, law enforcement, and academia, which greatly helped us to develop our thinking about some of the issues we deal with in the book. We were also able to conduct field research in Colombia and in Ghana, where we benefited from the help of organizations and interlocutors too numerous to list here. And finally, we owe a particular debt of gratitude to Danny Kushlik of the Transformed Drug Policy Foundation, who is here today, who has served as a consultant to this project and has provided us with the benefit of many years' experience dealing with this issue. So thank you very much, Danny. With that, I'll open the way for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will open it now to questions. If I ask you please to wait for the microphone to come to you, and then also if you could just identify yourself as a courtesy to Nigel and Virginia. I think the lady at the front first, please.
Elizabeth Kennett, otherwise Elizabeth Young. Could you say something about the relationship between the drug trades and the arms trade, and indeed the extent to which they depend on each other? Thank you.
Okay. I think it's difficult to draw too many conclusions about that because the situation varies very considerably from region to region. It is certainly the case that in respect of Mexico and Central America, there has been a lot of complaint from the Mexican authorities that many of the weapons used in the violence that is being experienced at the moment do originate in the United States of America. And I think there was a fairly prominent case that recently came to notice in which the U.S. Drugs Enforcement Administration sent a consignment of drugs into Mexico in order to identify tracking routes and lost sight of this weaponry, which duly found its way into the hands of criminal groups. Elsewhere in the world, I think the evidence for a clear connection is much less obvious. In a country like Afghanistan, for example, this is a country that has been awash with weaponry for the last 30 years at least. It's almost a rite of passage for every 8-year-old Afghan boy to get his own Kalashnikov. And I think also in Colombia, the prevalence of firearms is pretty pervasive. It's not clear that they come necessarily from one particular source. So it's hard to draw any hard and fast conclusions. There are some connections, but they do vary considerably from location to location.
Gentleman, second row, please.
Dawood Azami from BBC. I've been studying drug problem in Afghanistan and Colombia for some time, and I've been waiting for your book, Nigel, in Virginia for a long time. And congratulations, it's finally out. My question is about farmers and price. Farmers cultivate opium poppies, at least in Afghanistan, because it brings them more money than other normal crops. So what about subsidies as an alternative? Or what about introducing other crops? For example, in Afghanistan, some farmers have now started growing saffron, which is more expensive than wheat and other traditional crops. So subsidies is an alternative, or the introduction of other crops which are as expensive as drugs.
Should I take that? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I think I'll take those in reverse order. On crop substitution, this is a policy that has been implemented to some extent within Afghanistan already. And it has worked quite well in areas where the market infrastructure is in place to enable this, where farmers have access to markets and access to credit. These options are possible. And it's certainly the case that few Afghan farmers take active pleasure in cultivating opium. They do so because it offers them the best available option, and if a better one comes along, they tend to take it. And we've seen in some areas of Afghanistan, typically those less plagued by violence, that opium eradication has made some progress. But of course, these conditions do not apply to significant parts of Afghanistan, and they particularly don't apply in areas of the south and southeast, where a lot of poppy cultivation is taking place. And I think this is a project that is likely to take many years. If we look at other comparable examples of where opium cultivation has been eradicated, Turkey, Pakistan, Thailand, it has taken many, many years for this process to take hold. And an important concomitant, which is a key to success, has been the development of a normal economy, which takes up a lot of the slack. Now, when it comes to subsidies, this is obviously an alternative. You're talking about subsidies for alternative crops rather than for producing opium. I think this too is something that probably needs to be thought about, but it would have to be done as part of a more holistic approach towards economic and social development. I think applied in isolation, I think it has the potential to cause lots of perverse consequences in its own right. So I think it's going to take a long time before these policies can be made to work. That they can be made to work over time is demonstrated by examples elsewhere. But the key to all of this is some degree of stability and security, which currently does not exist. And I think our research has demonstrated pretty clearly that this is something where you really do have to apply sequencing. You can't really do counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics together. The one tends to cancel out the other. So it seems to me that what you have to do is counterinsurgency first, establish a baseline of stability and peace, and then turn your attention to counter-narcotics. I don't think you can do both at the same time.
Jonathan Paris, please.
I also want to congratulate Virginia and Nigel on this book. Nigel, I'm tempted to follow up on that question, ask you about the Haqqani network and their relation with drugs, but I want to turn to a different area which I don't think figures as much in the drug conversation, but will figure in the conflict situation. That's sub-Saharan Africa, in particular the Sahel. You have an area of enormous population growth, an area where 1/3 of the area will be middle class. And what do you predict? And if you could identify a few countries that you think we ought to watch in that area.
You want to take that? All right. Okay. Well, Virginia is our African expert, and I hope she will kick in on this. I think this is, I mean, there are a lot of imponderables here. We're seeing, for example, evidence of increased instability and violence in the Sahel. a reconstituted Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. We've seen the Tuareg rebellion in Mali. And there are intimations, suggestions that some of this is enabled by involvement in narcotics trafficking. I don't think we have, Virginia may correct me, but I don't think we have yet seen evidence that we would regard as entirely convincing of this. That, you know, particularly in the Sahel, the Tuareg have a long tradition of smuggling pretty much any commodity that turns a profit. So it would be unsurprising if they were involved in narcotics smuggling in addition to other things. But I think we need to be cautious about making too many assumptions here. Now, when it comes to these countries, as I think you meant potential consumer countries, this is of course is very difficult to predict. Logically, one might assume that countries that achieve greater levels of economic development and prosperity will see an increase in drugs consumption based on the same drivers that we have seen in the developed world. But there are some interesting things about drugs that we discovered in terms of our research, and these are a lot to do with cultural traditions. It's noteworthy, for example, that, to take a random example that we cite in the book, almost a quarter of all New Zealanders admit to having smoked cannabis. The comparable figure for Japan is 0.5% of the population. Now, why is this? Why do the British consume so much more cocaine than the French? We don't know, but it's true, they do. So there are a lot of factors at work here that I don't think we do understand as well as we might. Where we've actually seen the greatest increases in drugs consumption hasn't actually been in the newly emerging economies, though that is happening in countries like China, for example. But we've seen a significant rise in heroin misuse in Russia, in Iran, and this is a problem that's now starting to trickle through the other states of Central Asia. We've seen in Brazil, for example, a pretty thriving narco economy taking root in the favelas. The Brazilian government claims that it's taking effective action to deal with this problem. I think the jury is still out on how effective this will be. So actually, the evidence such as we have suggests that it tends to be more, the less well-off and more vulnerable countries that are, tend towards increased levels of drug use, particularly in some of the more serious drugs like heroin. But this is still, very nebulous. We don't have a huge amount of evidence to work with.
Yeah. Yes, Jonathan, sorry, I was talking to our chairman, so I missed the last part of your questions. Apologies. I think identifying links between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and the drug traffickers operating in West Africa has been one of the hardest things to do in the course of this research, because the more I spoke to people and the more I read the literature, I realized the same examples of few planes that had crashed or landed in the Sahel carrying drugs have been used over and over and over again, and it's very hard to find evidence beyond that, or at least not in open source research, or I couldn't find more evidence through the interviews I conducted in West Africa. However, as Nigel mentioned, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb operates quite widely in the Sahel, and it controlled some of the smuggling routes that have been used by the Tuareg for many, many centuries, and through which cigarettes, people, weapons have been smuggled. So it would be very surprising if those same routes were not used to transport drugs. Indeed, it is, of course, believed that some of the drugs that are smuggled northward from West Africa to North Africa indeed use those routes, land routes, so that they can reach, Morocco and then the traffickers can be helped by Galician fishermen to cross into the Iberian Peninsula, and from there traffic the drugs across Europe. I think, however, this link is really based on opportunities, and the opportunity from Al-Qaeda to get some fees to allow the traffickers to use their territories. This is nothing to do with ideology. And also another thing that I'm sure you're aware of, there is a strong racist feeling, and the people from North Africa don't really like people from Sub-Saharan Africa that much. There is very strong racism. So if they do cooperate, this is really based on the opportunity of some financial gain, where the West Africans are seen as junior partners. And of course, as also Nigel mentioned, in these developing countries, we have seen increasing trends of drug abuse. And I've been interviewing people working in NGOs in West Africa, and they were telling me examples of children as young as 12 taking cocaine and concoctions involving cocaine and marijuana regularly. Children as young as 12, and that's very sad. And let's not forget that in those countries, the health system, the welfare system is not as advanced as the one we have in the UK. And of course, this is a huge problem for the society.
Okay. Gentlemen, two-thirds, halfway back the middle. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Mike Trace from the International Drug Policy Consortium. I've got a question and a comment on the report, but first on this West African situation. There is a high-level event actually taking place this week, the next few days, hosted by the Kofi Annan Foundation, on exactly this question, trying to understand the information flows, trying to understand what it tells us about the nature of the security and the drug use problem in that region. So I would recommend that everybody here looks out for the conclusions of that piece of work, because they have gathered together a very impressive group of people to look at that this week. On the report itself, I think that in Nigel's presentation, the most important of those recommendations, I would contend, is the point made about trying to move away from thinking about a problem to be solved towards a phenomenon to be managed. And nowhere is it more impactful to change that thinking is in the area of law enforcement strategy. One of the problems we've all had, including myself over the years, is that we've always tried to frame our law enforcement strategies in terms of trying to stop the flow of drugs or in terms of defeating certain trafficking groups. It's really important, and I would say that a number of good law enforcement strategists in management are already getting to grips with this, is to say we need to think about how we manage their behavior as a collective in the way that causes the least harm to societies, either through security or health or social problems. Now, I would say UK is somewhat of a leader on this with Serious Organised Crime Agency that did some very serious work into this a few years back, trying to understand what that meant for tactics. What I think internationally we're on is we have more acceptance of that concept, but I'm not seeing all that much structured work going on within the law enforcement community to try and understand the implications of that change of focus. So my question to Nigel is that what would be the sort of mechanisms to promote to enable law enforcement strategists and senior management to get to grips with this change of focus? Because we have had 30, 40 years of assuming we're thinking in a certain way, and we need to at least adjust that thinking very quickly in terms of the new realities. What are the mechanisms by which law enforcement leaders can be helped to do that?
Should I take that? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Well, speaking as a former practitioner who has himself been involved in in counter-narcotics activity, I can certainly relate to that question. And I think it is true that thinking in law enforcement has evolved and become a lot more sophisticated. I would agree with you that the United Kingdom has been a leader in this. It's not been easy. I think when soccer really first began to adopt an intelligence-led, more strategic approach, this was not viewed with universal approbation by politicians, and I think it was a major driver for the Conservative party's decision to create this new agency into which soccer is to be folded. I think what happened, I'm speculating to some degree, is that the current government started out with some quite strong reservations about soccer policies, simply because they didn't seem to involve a lot of interdictions and the feelings of collars, and have gradually been won round to the efficacy of the soccer approach. I think one of the key issues, and while we have to continue to engage in law enforcement, and under the present dispensation I see no alternative to doing so, it is to encourage people to think as far up the chain as they possibly can go, and in particular to bring to bear more focused attention on dealing with the finances of this problem. The only way you are really going to hurt trafficking groups is by preventing them from benefiting financially from this trade. We've seen some steps towards this in terms of new powers of financial confiscation, proceeds of crime, etc., etc. But there's been very, very slow progress. It's clear to me that in this area at least, law enforcement is still only nibbling at the fringes of a very significant problem. I think the United Nations, UNODC, has calculated that in order to really have a sustained impact on the business model of narcotics trafficking groups, we would have to achieve a sustained 70% interdiction rate, and it's clear to me that we are nowhere near that. So interdiction of itself is unlikely to achieve the desired outcome, not least because we don't know 70% of what. One of the points we make early in this book is that at the end of the day, nobody really has a clue how big this trade is or what it's actually worth. We're guessing. We're really plucking figures from the air. But trying to map out the dimensions of the problem, trying to get as far upstream as possible, adopting a strategic approach, targeting those in the trade who benefit most from the trade, and depriving them of the proceeds of their activities has to be the way forward. It takes time, and it always takes more time than you think it is going to do to implement this kind of change. But I think that really is the only way forward.
All right. Two questions on this side of the room. Firstly, a gentleman in the black jacket, third row.
Thank you. Miguel Molina, I'm an independent journalist and analyst for Latin America. You mentioned that the drug problem should be not considered a problem, but rather an issue that needs to be managed. Is there a model or is there a country that would be worth watching or considering when dealing with this situation?
Yeah. Okay. Should I go on?
Yeah. So when you say watching in terms of growing...
or following the steps.
Yeah. Other models. Shall I?
Yeah, you can go. Well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we cite a number of cases where there's some interesting work being done, and there are some analogies from the past that we might be able to draw upon to some extent. In terms of models to be emulated, I think the one we highlight in our book is that of Portugal, which 10 years ago decriminalized the possession of all drugs for personal use. It still remains an offence in Portugal to traffic in drugs, and traffickers are still arrested and prosecuted. But in Portugal, nobody is subject to criminal penalties for just having drugs. Although if they are found in possession of drugs, they are required to undergo rehabilitation programs. And if one looks at the results of this over 10 years, the indications are that this policy has been quite encouragingly successful in terms of managing down demand consumption, particularly in problem user groups, And it has not had some of the deleterious effects that one might have assumed. Drug traffickers have not flocked to Portugal as a sort of easy way in, an easy option. Levels of consumption in Portugal have not risen, and levels of drugs-related criminality do appear to have dropped. So I think that is an interesting model to emulate, and it marries up with some theoretical academic research that has been conducted by a number of economists, particularly in the United States, people like Peter Reuter of the RAND Group, others that we cite, that actually the public health approach to counter-narcotics is probably the one that delivers, if you pardon the reference, the biggest bang for the buck. In terms of historical analogies, well, we cite the United Kingdom's example with gin in the 18th century. When this commodity first came to the United Kingdom, it had devastating effects. People drank gin as if it was beer, and calamitous consequences. But over time, during the course of the 18th century, gin was subjected to a rigorous licensing regime, which resulted in much better quality controls and limited access to consumption through taxation and other means. So that's one area that we could cite. The other area is what's happening in the developed world with smoking. Smoking remains legal. Governments derive significant revenues from tobacco. But we've seen a raft of measures implemented in recent years which kind of crowd the use of tobacco towards the margins of society, making it less acceptable, harder to do, more expensive, and this is another option that I think could be considered.
Okay. Gentleman in the second row, please.
Richard Lavers, Foro Consulting and former British ambassador in the Northern Triangle countries. Can I offer a comment, please? I think that you're dead right when you talk about how violence has been present in these countries for a very long time. I left Guatemala in 2006, and 6,000 people were actually murdered that year. The figure today would be very much worse. There were deeply entrenched criminal mafias, the so-called poderes paralelos, and they were there. They've now been overlain and mixed up with narco traffickers, particularly from Mexico. And the problem is very deep-seated and very, very difficult to see how it can be dealt with. I was on a visit to the region recently, and I was struck how both in Honduras and Panama they were talking about narco-terrorism. I think it's absolutely right that the countries that are consumer countries should offer far greater assistance to these countries that are very fragile and very, very weak in many respects. I think that assistance will need to include security assistance to the military as well as the police, and that will pose all sorts of very delicate questions for the human rights community. Finally, the states are weak. For example, the writ of the state doesn't really run in the paten. Institutions need strengthening, and in particular, the judiciary. So there's a very difficult and long agenda. It'll take many years. It won't be easy.
Thank you very much. I think your comments are very much in line with what we conclude in the book with regard to Central America. The situation is very scary. Just one thing I'd like to add, that of course more financial support to improve police, the military, the judicial service is certainly welcome. However, I would stress that development, to me, is one of the key to success. We are still talking about countries where there is very high levels of unemployment, low education, serious proportion of society suffer from malnutrition. So I think development should go handy, and education should go hand in hand with the military.
Yeah. Virginia is perhaps of a more liberal cast of mind than I am. I tend to associate myself more with Richard's observations about the need for consumer countries, to grasp this nettle of assisting countries that are under very severe pressure. It's not an easy thing to do. There are severe problems, of human rights associated with conflicts of this kind, and it is always the case that when one is dealing with levels of criminality which are tantamount to a counterinsurgency, that government overreaction leads to bad behavior, as General David Petraeus observed in his forward to the U.S. Army counterinsurgency manual. Counterinsurgencies normally begin poorly, and what's happening in Central America, what happened in Colombia, no exceptions. But I don't think that should be used by producer countries as an excuse not to get involved in some of the hard security areas that have to be dealt with. When governments are subject to an existential threat, they have to fight back. What else are they supposed to do? And it seems to me that it is incumbent upon developed Western world to provide more useful assistance and possibly a little bit less hand-wringing.
Gentleman right at the back in the middle, please.
Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. Two quick questions, one a factual one. When you talk about vested interests against change in the US, China and Russia, could you explain a little bit what you mean by that? Is it just law enforcement or is it others, and are those vested interests in the UK too? And a second sort of wider question, what do you say to the reactionary response to what you're saying, which is you've given up, the answer is to redouble the efforts, double the resources and continue the war?
Okay. Okay. Well, when I talk about vested interests, there are, of course, many. The correctional lobby in the United States is a good example of an interest group that derives very considerable benefits from current policies. In countries like China and Russia, I think the issue is more complex. The Chinese Communist Party's foundation myth is very much bound up with the 100 years of humiliation, the Banyan Guoche, of unequal treaties, opium sales, and so on. And I think for a country like China in present circumstances to adopt a dramatically different position on narcotics to that which it currently does is really politically and culturally very difficult. And I think the same is true of Russia. Our sense there is that the Russian state has tended to focus on the issue of supply of drugs like heroin, because it doesn't want to face up to the domestic policy failures that are responsible for widespread heroin use within Russia. And of course we have international structures and bureaucracies, law enforcement organizations obviously, who derive their status and their resources from implementing the existing policies. So vested interests are pretty widespread. Now, in answer to your second question, well, yes, I think we are vulnerable, I suppose, to accusations of defeatism. But if one adds up the amount of resources over the past 50 years that have been devoted to creating what UNGASS has called a drugs-free world, it's not obvious to me that these efforts have been notably successful. At the end of the day, what we're dealing with here is the iron laws of supply and demand. And when there is a demand for a commodity, there is always going to be somebody who will seek to meet that demand, particularly when the profits entailed are as enormous, markups of many 1,000% between farm gate and retail sales. These economic imperatives are pretty difficult to resist. Most of those arguing for a continuation of the status quo tend to do so on the counterfactual. Essentially, if we didn't do what we were doing, levels of drug consumption worldwide would be far worse than they actually are. And analogies are often made with the tobacco industry. 1 billion people consume tobacco products worldwide. Only around just over 200 million people, according to UN ODC figures, consume drugs. But that seems to me, from many points of view, an actually rather flawed argument. The research that we've looked at suggests, for example, that when one looks at price elasticity of drugs, this varies considerably from drug to drug. Cocaine looks quite price elastic. In other words, if the price drops, levels of consumption rise. The same tends not to be true of heroin. Drop in price does not tend to translate into a significantly increased level of usage. So there are a number of factors I think we need to be brought into this debate, and simply saying well, it goes back to any first-year medical student will tell you that the first thing they are taught when they step through the door is don't just double the dose. If your initial diagnosis doesn't seem to be working, don't just keep on doing the same thing, and hope that something different will eventuate, because it probably won't.
Virginia.
Yes, just to add a little bit, what we would say to those who accuse us of being defeatist and giving up, I think two things. First of all, we would tell them just to look at the evidence. And the evidence is that 51 years after the UN conventions have been signed, none of the objectives that were established, that were listed in the convention, have been achieved, i.e. the prevention of widespread production, trafficking, and abuse of drugs. But that hasn't happened. The second thing, which I think is very, very important, is that the cost-benefit analysis of the war on drugs is very different if this analysis is conducted in the developed world or in the developing world. In fact, in the developed world, the drugs issue is an issue of law enforcement and health. In the developing world, the drug world is an existential problem because of all the problems of violence and instability and corruption we spoke about today. So it depends who is looking at this issue.
Right, we have time for two more brief questions. Firstly, a gentleman in the green, please. Sorry, if you can just got the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Tim Kello. I work for an NGO in Sierra Leone, and I conducted some research on the cocaine trade in Africa 2 years ago. I'd just like to really come back to the point that we were talking earlier about the Sahel, and really all the attention since 2005 has really been focused on the cocaine trade going through West Africa, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Liberia, etc. But when I was doing research there seemed to be quite a strong opinion among many of the people that I was speaking to who were aware of both sides of the continent, that there was a growing problem, especially in the last few years, of heroin coming from Eastern Africa, coming up through the north, with links to the Italian mafia and presumably again to Akim in the Sahel. And I just wondered really, why you think this isn't mentioned much in this debate, and whether you cover it in your book.
Well, actually, apologize for not mentioning the heroin issue in West Africa in the presentation, but it is actually part of the book. We looked at it. So we look at the transit from East Asia into, the Middle East, East Africa, West Africa, and then, to Europe or the United States. And in fact, this is a growing problem. And even though we focus a lot on cocaine and heroin, there is also synthetic drugs that are being produced in greater numbers in West Africa, and a number of laboratories have been discovered and dismantled by the authorities. So certainly that's that's a growing issue, and you can certainly find any type of drugs you want in West Africa these days.
Okay, final question. Gentleman, second row, please.
David Page. It's an intriguing title, and it just struck me as you were going on, particularly Nigel, when you mentioned about the vested interests and the dirty money circulating, is if you cross out the word problem and insert profit, has there ever been a calculation of the consuming nations, how much they actually make from the drugs trade? And I particularly refer to the amount of dirty money that circulates in the City of London, but more particularly in the dependencies in the Caribbean, where we have singly failed to do anything, which makes me worried that in actual fact we're making more money out of it than we are losing.
I think the short answer is no, nobody's made that calculation, but you raise an interesting point. And we do actually refer to the issue of money laundering and drugs money laundering in the book. It's a very difficult issue to address because there rapidly comes a point at which you stop and ask yourself, well, how is dirty money actually different from clean money? Once it's been laundered, is a hospital built, with the proceeds of drugs trafficking any less worthwhile a social utility than one that was built out of general taxation? I realize that's an extreme example, but it does raise some interesting questions about the relationship that consuming countries have to the profits of from the drugs trade. It's a very fair point, and it's something we ought to think more about.
Draw things to a close there. If anybody doesn't have a copy of the book and would like it, you can buy it today at the front desk downstairs for cut price £8, usually 10. I'd ask you now just to join me in thanking our speakers for their presentations.
Thank you.